When blacks were imported into colonial Mexico, there were four things they could pretty well plan on happening. They would be branded with a hot iron, baptized into Christianity, given a new and different name, and then enslaved. My name is Robert Siefken. Welcome to part one of two of my presentation called Blacks in Colonial Mexico, Branded, Baptized, Renamed, and Enslaved. Let's begin. So, what can a country do when around 90% of its labor force just gets simply wiped off the face of the earth by illness and disease? One option, I suppose, is to import workers from somewhere else. And unfortunately, for many blacks throughout history, when there was a serious labor gap, they were the ones chosen to be imported as workers. Problem is, part of their being imported to another place meant they were usually kidnapped and used as slaves. Such was the scenario during the days of colonial Mexico between the years 1521 and 1821 AD. Here's a little bit of background. The conquest of the Aztecs by Spaniards was pretty much complete by 1521 AD. These Europeans brought with them more than one disease to which the indigenous were not immune and from which they started dying in huge numbers. Thus began what's been referred to as Ameripox or the Great Dying. By about the year 1600 AD, around 90% of the indigenous in colonial Mexico had been wiped out, mostly by illness and disease. This in turn caused a serious labor shortage. So, how did these diseases even show up in the first place? More than one historical account has reported that an African slave in the company of Conquistador Hernan Cortes unwittingly introduced one of these diseases, smallpox, with him to the New World in the spring of 1520. Over the course of the 300-year existence of colonial Mexico, it's estimated about 200,000 blacks were imported to be used as slaves to fill the labor gap resulting from so many indigenous that became sick and died. To put things in perspective, though, they never represented more than 2% of the total population of colonial Mexico. Since many of the blacks shipped off to colonial Mexico were coming from Europe, they already did have immunity to many, perhaps most European diseases, and, unlike the indigenous, tended not to become ill or die from those same diseases. As part of the ethnically based system of assigning and determining your standing in colonial Mexico, a caste system existed. As part of the caste system, different terms were used for blacks in particular. The term bozal, spelled with an S with a Z or an S, was used to describe black slaves that had been taken directly from Africa and then imported to the New World. So this term was used to distinguish them from black slaves coming over from Europe or someplace else. Pardo. This is a racially ambiguous term. It was sometimes used by dark-skinned individuals of obvious African ancestry who possessed a certain educational, social, or economic background, but they wanted to avoid being classified as black. Maroons or cimarrones, these were descendants of Africans in the Americas who escaped from slavery but formed their own settlements. They often mixed with indigenous peoples, eventually evolving into separate Creole cultures such as the Garifuna and the Mascogos. The term mulatto. This refers to an individual of mixed white and black ancestry. It's been in use for centuries. The term is typically used to include all of those of mixed white blood and with black blood, but without consideration for the degree of mixture. One historian argues that the term mulatto is a Latin term for mule, and it linked the idea of being a mule with a person with mixed blood. So the mule was the hybrid product of the mating of a horse and a donkey. As such, mulattoes were perceived as the product of an unnatural union. Over many centuries, mulattoes have been a constant reminder of the historical raping and coercion of black women. In some cases, the unions between white men and black women, as well as those between white women and black men, were thought to be consensual. But the majority of unions were a result of violent sexual coercion by whites in an effort to enforce the racial oppression of blacks. Pieza. Translated from Spanish, it means piece or a piece of. A pieza was a standard able bodied slave. Some slaves were classified as fractions of a pieza based on factors like sex, age, health, and skill. Seems odd to me to think that a human being might be classified as 1/4 or one eighth of a piece if they were seen as substandard for a variety of reasons. But then again, for a fairly long period of time, blacks in the United States were seen as only 3/5 of a person as designated in our own national constitution. Your station in life in colonial Mexico depended a great deal on your ethnicity, ancestry, and your gender. These factors combined, among others, are generally known as castas or the caste system. It could be seen as a social and societal pecking order to identify who was more important and who was less important. Not surprisingly, those in the designated less important or inferior categories had fewer rights, but more obligations, including taxes and tributes. Toward the very bottom of the caste system were the blacks. Blacks in colonial Mexico also found themselves in what you might call a middle ground. Politics and society were pretty well divided into two unequal spheres: the Republic of the Spaniards and the Republic of the Indians. The blacks belonged to neither, but were definitely beholden to the Republic of the Spaniards. When Spaniards came to Mexico in the early 1500s, they did not bring many women with them at first, so predictably, this led to mixed race relationships, mixed race affairs, and of course, mixed race babies. Over the course of time, miscegenation was so widespread that, as you can see from this chart, by the latter 1700s, the mixed races, the mestizos and mulattoes, had clearly become the majority of the population. Toward the end of the colonial period, by the way, the term mestizo was more encompassing in that it was then also used to describe or include mulattoes. So far, I presented some general information about blacks in colonial Mexico, but now I'd like to discuss some noteworthy individuals in particular during this era. In New Spain, there came a Dominican friar named Bartolomé de las Casas, who became known as the protector of the Indians. It was through his efforts that the new laws of 1542 came about. These were more formally known as the New Laws of the Indies for the good treatment and preservation of the Indians. For most of his life, Bartolomé de las Casas fought against the abuses of the Indians as well as against slavery. He pleaded with the crown for more humane treatment of these peoples. He's seen by some as one of the very first advocates for the larger concept of human rights and human dignity. He met with some disappointments, but at the same time, he was able to gain great and important successes. So, what does a guy who was so involved in protecting the Indians have to do with the subject of blacks and black slaves in colonial Mexico? Fact of the matter is, he petitioned the Spanish crown to have black slaves brought into the New World. Why on earth did he do that, you might ask? Here's why. Like I said earlier, by the year 1600 or so, around 90% of the indigenous population had been wiped out, mostly by European diseases. The big problem for the Spaniards, of course, most of their labor force was now gone. Somebody had to fill that gap. Unfortunately, an obvious possible choice of the time was the importation of black slaves. In colonial Mexico, the indigenous had been forced into different kinds of labor systems, but they were not technically considered to be slaves per se. So you might think they'd be better off because of that, but in reality, they were worse off, and here's why. Way back in the year 1348, Spain adopted a code of conduct called Siete Partidas. This code, not surprisingly, was modified over the years, but it did address the issue of slavery and a slave master's conduct toward and responsibility for their slaves. Certain kinds of mistreatment of slaves were forbidden, and there were ways for slaves to become free. It was this code that led Bartolomé de las Casas to believe that slavery was humane and terminable. So, compared to the even more miserable and inhumane treatment of indigenous laborers in colonial Mexico at the time, slavery seemed the lesser of two evils. De las Casas originally petitioned the crown for a relatively small number of slaves, and that those slaves who were to be imported be only those who were slaves already. So, in other words, what he did not want was for free black slaves to find themselves enslaved for this purpose. Unfortunately for De las Casas, his petition opened up a floodgate, and many more slaves were brought into this picture than he would have wanted to see. All in all, though, it matters to know that Bartolomé de las Casas believed in the humanity of all ethnicities, as evidenced by his all-inclusive message of all the peoples of the world are men. Another interesting and noteworthy personality of this era was a black man named Esteban de Dorantes. Some of us humans have led exceptional lives, and then there are those who have led really exceptional lives. Such is the case of a black man in colonial Mexico in the early 1500s named Esteban de Dorantes. Some of his aliases included Esteban the Moor, Estebanico, the Black Mexican, Stephen the Black. Here's and so on. So here's what happened. Esteban was born in northwestern Africa, and in 1522 he was taken captive by the Portuguese military, who then sold him into slavery to a man named Andreas Dorantes. Dorantes then took him to the New World, the Americas, to be part of an excursion into Florida led by a guy named Panfilo de Narvaez in 1527. There were 400 men and 42 horses in the expedition. They met with an enormous amount of resistance from the natives there, and in the end, they set sail back into the Gulf of Mexico. But their navigation and sailing skills were apparently seriously lacking, and they got into big trouble. So, as you can see from the map, they went west, and by the time they washed up on shore at Galveston Island off of modern-day Texas in 1528, only 15 men had survived, one of them being the black man named Esteban. They crossed over to the mainland, where they were captured and enslaved by natives. By 1534, only 4 of them, including Esteban and his master, were still alive. And 1534 was when they were able to successfully escape from their captors and head off to the west. After encountering natives who were thankfully this time friendly, this small band of travelers came across some Spanish slave hunters who they persuaded to take them all the way to Mexico City. They got there in 1536. Rumors had been flying among the Spaniards in Mexico City of fabulous wealth and riches in what is now the American Southwest. The rumors were so convincing, it was decided an expedition should be sent there for further exploration. Esteban's master sold him to the Viceroy of New Spain, who in 1539 tasked Esteban with being the guide in search of the famed 7 cities of Cibola. One of those accompanying Esteban on this journey was a man named Fray Marcos de Niza. Fray, by the way, is the Spanish word for friar. Well, reportedly, these 2 men didn't get along, presumably because the good friar did not appreciate that a black man had been given such a level of authority. Once they got to the modern day American Southwest, a complex and uncertain turn of events led to either the disappearance of Esteban or perhaps his death. Either way, Fray Marcos de Niza was able to get back to Mexico City, and once he got there, he regaled the Spaniards there with lies about great cities that held enormous wealth and riches to be had. Why the lies, you might ask? Well, one of the best theories I've come across is that the friar wanted to lure more Spaniards into that area so more Indians could be converted to Christianity. Thus ends my tale of a black man during the age of colonial Mexico who, without question, led a seriously adventurous and eventful life. Thus also ends part one of two of my presentation of blacks in colonial Mexico, branded, baptized, renamed, and enslaved. Hope to see you for part two of this presentation.